Imagine a society where every factory, farm, and shop answers to a single central authority. There is no invisible hand of the market guiding production and prices, no competition between private owners, and no profit-driven entrepreneurs shaping the flow of goods and services. Instead, a government body, acting on behalf of the collective, sets the nation's course, deciding what will be produced, in what quantities, and at what price. This is the essence of a command economy, also known as a planned economy, a system where the government's influence extends across all aspects of economic life. At its core, a command economy is defined by the dominance of central governmental control. Unlike a market economy, where supply and demand determine what gets made and at what cost, a command economy operates through administrative planning. Economic decisions, what goods are needed, how much should be produced, and how resources are allocated, are all made by a central authority, often a vast bureaucracy. Most industries, from heavy manufacturing to daily necessities, are publicly owned. The government does not simply set broad rules, it actively manages the details of economic activity, issuing directives and regulations that shape the nation's productive efforts. This approach stands in stark contrast to the two other major types of economic systems: market economies and mixed economies. In a market economy, private ownership prevails. The forces of supply and demand, driven by countless individual decisions, determine what is made, how it is made, and who gets what. Prices fluctuate freely, guided by the interplay of buyers and sellers. The government's role is minimal, mostly limited to enforcing basic rules and protecting property rights. Mixed economies, as the name suggests, blend elements of both systems. They allow for private enterprise and market forces, but also include government intervention to correct market failures or ensure a minimum standard of welfare. In a command economy, however, the state's guiding hand is present in every transaction. Private ownership, if it exists at all, is extremely limited. The government owns the means of production, including land, factories, and resources. There is little or no room for private property in the economic sphere. Instead, collective ownership and public interest are seen as the highest priorities. The government sets national goals, whether rapid industrialization, self-sufficiency, or economic equality, and steers the economy to achieve them. Production targets are assigned, resources allocated, and output closely monitored to ensure compliance with the central plan. Prices in a command economy are not the result of negotiation or competition. They are fixed by the government, often as part of multi-year economic plans. The rationale is straightforward. By setting prices and production levels, the government hopes to avoid the inefficiencies, inequalities, and uncertainties that can arise in an unregulated market. Instead of profit, the central goal is to maximize social welfare and minimize disparities. In theory, no one profits at the expense of others, and the needs of the community are put ahead of individual gain. The theoretical roots of command economies can be traced to the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They envisioned a system where the means of production would be commonly owned, and economic decisions would reflect the needs of the collective rather than the interests of a privileged few. The command economy became a hallmark of communist societies, most famously the Soviet Union and the countries of the Eastern Bloc. These societies rejected the capitalist model of private ownership and market competition, seeking instead to direct all economic activity toward national and social objectives. Central planning requires an enormous bureaucracy. Ministries and planning agencies draw up detailed production plans, sometimes spanning several years. They decide not only what should be produced, but also how much raw material each factory receives and how finished goods are distributed. Distribution itself may be managed through mechanisms like ration books, ensuring that everyone receives at least a minimum share of essential goods. The process is top-down, with decisions flowing from the highest levels of government to individual enterprises and workers. This high degree of centralization comes with trade-offs. On one hand, it allows governments to mobilize resources quickly, pursue ambitious projects, and address social inequalities directly. On the other, it limits consumer choice and individual economic freedom. In a command economy, consumers have far fewer alternatives. Shops may offer only a handful of products, all produced according to the central plan. Competition is absent, as state-owned enterprises do not compete against each other for customers or profits. Instead, they carry out assigned tasks, with success measured against production targets rather than market share or profit margins. The loss of individual economic sovereignty is one of the defining features of command economies. Individuals do not freely choose what to produce or how to invest. Instead, the government directs economic effort toward collective goals. This can create a sense of shared purpose, but it also removes the incentives and flexibility that drive innovation and responsiveness in market economies. Critics argue that without price signals, central planners struggle to match supply with demand, often resulting in shortages or surpluses. When prices do not reflect scarcity or consumer preferences, economic coordination can become a matter of guesswork rather than discovery. Historically, command economies have been most closely associated with communist governments. The Soviet Union stands as the archetype, but other examples include China for much of the 20th century, Cuba, North Korea, Belarus, Iran, and Libya. In these countries, the government has exercised varying degrees of control over economic activity, shaping not only what is produced and consumed, but also the very structure of society. Some, like China, have since introduced market reforms, while others, such as North Korea, continue to follow a more traditional command model. The concept of a command economy is not just a matter of ownership or planning. It is a vision of society in which collective interest outweighs individual autonomy and social goals are pursued through centralized action. It is founded on principles of collectivism, equality, and public property. Whether this vision succeeds or falters has been the subject of much debate, and the realities have often diverged from the ideals. As we move forward, it is important to keep in mind both the theoretical aspirations and the practical outcomes of command economies. This understanding will provide a foundation for exploring their complexities and assessing their impact on the world stage. Imagine a vast, intricate machine, each gear and lever operated by the hands of a select few at its center. This is the world of central planning, a system in which the government holds the blueprint not only for major industries but for the daily rhythm of economic life. The mechanics of such an economy revolve around a central authority, often embodied by planning agencies, ministries, and layers of bureaucracy. These bodies do not merely suggest, they command. Through a web of regulations, decrees, and directives, they dictate what is produced, how much, by whom, and at what price, aiming to shape the economy according to their vision of national priorities. At the core of central planning stands the planning agency, a powerful institution tasked with turning broad economic goals into specific instructions. This agency, sometimes called the Central Planning Board or Commission, is responsible for gathering information from across the nation's statistics on population, inventories of resources, reports from factories and farms. With this data in hand, planners attempt to estimate the needs of society and the capacities of industry. They construct comprehensive plans, often spanning several years, mapping out production quotas for factories, acreage to be sown for farms, and labor to be assigned to different sectors. The process is methodical yet deeply challenging. Without the guidance of market price signals, planners must estimate demand for everything from steel to shoes. They use administrative tools, production quotas, price controls, and rationing to channel resources where they believe they are most needed. For example, if the state decides to prioritize heavy industry, it will direct steel, machinery, and labor toward factories producing turbines and locomotives, sometimes at the expense of consumer goods. The government owns and distributes capital, labor, and raw materials, entrusting state-run enterprises with carrying out assigned tasks. In key industries, energy, transport, communications, state monopolies are the norm, and competition is deliberately suppressed to maintain unity of purpose. To implement these plans, the government relies on a hierarchy of ministries, each overseeing a sector of the economy. These ministries break down the central plan into regional and local targets, passing instructions through layers of administration. At the ground level, factory managers and collective farm leaders receive detailed orders, what to produce, in what quantities, and by what deadlines. Performance is measured not by profit, but by the extent to which these targets are met. Compliance is enforced through a mix of incentives, such as bonuses for exceeding quotas and penalties for falling short. This system of command and accountability is designed to keep the vast machinery of the economy moving in step with the central plan. Resource allocation is perhaps the most intricate aspect of central planning. The government must decide not only what to produce, but how to distribute scarce inputs, labor, capital, materials across the economy. In the absence of market prices, planners use administrative estimations, assigning resources according to macroeconomic goals. For example, if a region is designated for industrial expansion, planners allocate additional workers, construction materials, and energy supplies to that area. Labor itself is subject to government mandates and regulations. Workers may be assigned to factories or farms based on the needs of the plan, with limited room for personal preference. Setting prices is another critical task for planners. Rather than allowing prices to fluctuate in response to supply and demand, the government fixes prices by decree. These official prices are intended to reflect the state's priorities, making essential goods affordable, encouraging production in strategic sectors, or discouraging consumption of scarce resources. However, without the feedback provided by market transactions, these prices often misalign with real conditions. The result, historically, has been a persistent pattern of surpluses and shortages. Factories might produce more boots than needed, while everyday necessities like fresh fruit or soap remain in chronically short supply. Over time, the uniformity of products and the rigidity of plans have left their mark on daily life. Accounts from within command economies often mention the drab sameness of available goods. Store shelves may be filled with only one type of coat or a single brand of canned food, all produced according to the central plan. The lack of variety stems from the absence of competition. Since state enterprises do not vie for customers, there is little incentive to innovate or cater to diverse consumer tastes. Instead, the focus remains on fulfilling quotas and meeting planned targets. When shortages become acute, alternative systems frequently arise. Black markets, informal channels where goods are traded outside official distribution, often emerge in response to unmet needs. These markets serve as a safety valve, providing access to goods that the central plan has failed to deliver. While officially condemned, they are sometimes tolerated in practice as a way to relieve pressure on the system. Political considerations also shape the workings of central planning. The allocation of resources and the setting of targets can reflect not just economic logic, but the priorities of those in power. Leaders may favor certain regions, industries, or groups for strategic or political reasons, further complicating the challenge of efficient resource distribution. Incentives for managers and workers may be structured as much to reward political loyalty as to promote productivity. The organizational structure of a command economy is both hierarchical and highly centralized. Decision-making authority flows from the top down, with little room for local adaptation or feedback. Ministries and planning agencies issue directives, state enterprises and collective farms execute them. Success is measured in the aggregate by how closely reality matches the plan, rather than by the satisfaction of individual consumers or the profits of enterprises. Yet, for all its order and ambition, central planning is a system perpetually at odds with complexity. The sheer volume of information required to match resources with needs, especially in large, diverse societies, can overwhelm even the most diligent planners. Without the benefit of price indices and market feedback, the system relies on assumptions and approximations, making perfect coordination an elusive goal. This is the machinery of command economies, a world where the government holds the levers, striving to direct the flow of goods, labor, and capital with precision and intent. The result is a distinctive structure, disciplined, centralized, and deeply shaped by the priorities and limitations of those who wield the power to plan. To understand the realities of command economies, it is essential to move from abstract theory to the lived experiences of the countries that adopted this model on a grand scale. Among the most prominent examples, the Soviet Union and Maoist China stand out not only for the sheer size of their planned economies, but also for the ways their stories shape the global conversation about the promises and pitfalls of central planning. The Soviet Union, from its inception in 1922 until its dissolution in 1991, embodied the Marxist-Leninist vision of a society guided by detailed state planning. Soviet leaders pursued economic coordination with remarkable ambition, orchestrating vast industrial projects and mobilizing resources to transform a largely agrarian society into a formidable industrial power. This transformation was not only economic but also deeply social, as the state sought to reshape society according to the principles of socialism. The Soviet model became a blueprint for other countries embracing command economies, especially in the post-World War II Eastern Bloc, where economic integration was consolidated through organizations like the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, binding member states to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics orbit, yet beneath these achievements lay persistent difficulties. The Soviet system's focus on central direction led to an overemphasis on heavy industry at the expense of other sectors, a point that drew criticism even from other communist leaders. Mao Zedong, for example, observed that Soviet priorities often disregarded agriculture and long-term social needs, resulting in imbalances that would later haunt the system. These imbalances became painfully evident during periods of crisis. The forced collectivization of Soviet agriculture in the early 1930s led to catastrophic outcomes, most notably the famine known as the Holodomor, which struck Ukraine and other regions with devastating effect. The lack of market feedback and the rigidity of top-down quotas meant that shortages could quickly escalate into humanitarian disasters. Despite these flaws, the Soviet Union achieved significant successes, particularly in its early decades. Rapid industrialization enabled the country to withstand and ultimately repel the Nazi invasion during World War II, and Soviet science and technology made notable strides, as seen in the space race. However, by the 1970s and 1980s, the limitations of the system became increasingly pronounced. The centrally planned economy, once a source of national pride, grew cumbersome and inefficient. Chronic shortages of consumer goods, declining productivity, and a growing black market signaled a system under strain. Efforts at reform in the late Soviet period, such as those initiated under Mikhail Gorbachev, failed to overcome these deep-rooted problems. Ultimately, the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving behind a mixed legacy of industrial might and economic dysfunction. Maoist China offers a distinct but related case study. After the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, Mao Zedong set out to construct a command economy that would, in his words, consolidate revolutionary victory and build a new society. The state took control of industry and agriculture, directing resources to realize ambitious goals. One of the most dramatic episodes in this period was the Great Leap Forward, a campaign intended to catapult China past Western powers in terms of industrial output and to usher in a new era of collective prosperity. Instead, the campaign revealed the dangers of radical central planning. Farmers were organized into massive communes, and unrealistic production targets were set from above. Local officials, fearing punishment for underperformance, often exaggerated output, distorting the information available to planners. The result was a catastrophic famine, with millions of lives lost, a tragedy rooted in the system's inability to respond flexibly to local realities. The Maoist era also saw efforts to reshape society through campaigns like the Cultural Revolution, which further disrupted economic life and deepened the country's isolation. By the late 1970s, the shortcomings of the command model had become impossible to ignore. Productivity lagged, poverty was widespread, and China remained largely cut off from the world economy. At this juncture, Deng Xiaoping initiated a bold shift. Drawing lessons from both China's and the Soviet Union's experiences, he spearheaded reforms that loosened central controls, encouraged market mechanisms, and opened the country to foreign trade and investment. These reforms did not abandon the state's guiding role altogether, but they marked a decisive move away from rigid central planning. The contrast between China's and the Soviet Union's reform trajectories is striking. Where Soviet efforts at reform in the 1980s failed to address the system's foundational problems, resulting in economic collapse and political upheaval, China's gradual, experimental approach delivered sustained growth and dramatic poverty reduction. By integrating elements of the market economy while retaining significant state oversight, China avoided the kind of systemic shock that destabilized the USSR. This divergence has prompted much analysis among scholars, who point to differences in strategy, leadership, and institutional flexibility as key factors in China's relative success. Beyond these two giants, other countries also adopted command economic models with varying outcomes. North Vietnam, from its founding in 1946 until the mid-1970s, pursued central planning in the context of war and reconstruction. The state directed resources toward military and industrial objectives, achieving some success and mobilizing for conflict, but the system struggled to deliver sustained prosperity. Similar patterns emerged in Eastern European states within the Soviet sphere. Here, planning was often less rigid than in the USSR, and some countries experimented with limited market reforms. Nonetheless, the overall pattern was one of stagnation and eventual decline, with shortages and inefficiencies common to all. As command economies transitioned either rapidly, as in Russia, or gradually, as in China, the challenges of reform became evident. The shift from collective ownership to private enterprise required the development of new institutions, such as property rights and legal frameworks, to support market transactions. These transitions were fraught with difficulty. Russia's rapid, chaotic privatization in the 1990s, for example, led to economic instability and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, while China's more controlled approach maintained social stability and steady growth. Looking back at these case studies, several lessons come into focus. Central planning made possible feats of mobilization and industrialization that would have been difficult to achieve otherwise, especially in societies starting from relative backwardness. However, the very features that lent command economies their initial strength, rigid coordination, absence of market signals, and political centralization, became sources of weakness over time. They struggled to adapt to changing conditions, foster innovation, or respond to the needs and preferences of ordinary people. The historical record of the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and their contemporaries offers a complex picture, one of grand designs and human costs, of achievements shadowed by inefficiency and, at times, tragedy. Today, the legacy of command economies continues to inform debates about the role of the state in economic life and the enduring challenge of balancing collective goals with individual initiative. When we examine the strengths of command economies, advocates often emphasize their ability to marshal resources in pursuit of social objectives. These systems are structured to prioritize social welfare and economic stability, and their defenders argue that centralized direction can overcome some of the pitfalls that afflict unregulated markets. In theory, command economies can achieve low unemployment rates, since the state can guarantee jobs by assigning labor according to national priorities. Supporters contend that this approach helps ensure everyone has access to work and basic necessities, reducing the risk of poverty and social exclusion. Another frequently cited advantage is the command economy's capacity to act decisively in times of crisis. When rapid mobilization is needed, whether to recover from disaster, respond to war, or complete large-scale infrastructure projects, the centralized nature of planning allows for swift action. There is no need to wait for market signals or rely on the profit motives of private firms. Planners can redirect resources, instruct factories to produce what is required, and organize labor on a massive scale. The results can be seen in projects that reshape entire societies, from building cities to electrifying rural regions within a few years. In moments of emergency or reconstruction, this ability for top-down decision-making can be a genuine asset. Supporters also argue that command economies are well equipped to address market failures that might otherwise leave vulnerable groups behind. By controlling production and distribution, the government can ensure universal access to essentials such as healthcare, housing, and education. At least in concept, the system is positioned to prevent monopoly abuses and extreme inequalities that sometimes arise in purely market-driven settings. For those who believe the goal of economics is to lift all boats and reduce disparities, the ethos of planning putting collective needs above individual gain holds significant appeal. However, the challenges facing command economies are as fundamental as their ambitions. One of the most persistent criticisms centers on incentives, or rather, the lack of them. Without the pressures and rewards that come from competition and profit-seeking, there is little motivation for managers, workers, or even planners to strive for greater efficiency or innovation. Tasks may be completed because they are ordered, not because there is personal or organizational benefit in doing them well. Over time, this can drain the system of energy and creativity, leading to stagnation and waste. Closely related to the incentive problem is the issue of information. Critics argue that, no matter how capable or well-intentioned, central planners can never possess all the local tacit knowledge needed to allocate resources and match production with actual needs. The absence of market signals, prices that reflect scarcity and demand, forces planners to rely on estimates, reports, and assumptions, which are often outdated, incomplete, or distorted by those seeking to meet quotas or avoid blame. The result is a pattern of inefficiency, with some goods piling up unsold while others remain perennially scarce. Waste becomes a feature of the system, born from the impossibility of managing a complex economy from a single vantage point. Bureaucracy, by necessity, becomes the engine of the command economy. Yet, as the administrative apparatus expands, so do its inefficiencies. Layers of ministries, agencies, and offices are needed to translate high-level plans into daily operations. While this structure is intended to provide order and direction, it can instead create bottlenecks, slow decision-making, and foster a culture where following rules and avoiding mistakes take precedence over real problem-solving. Studies of bureaucratic systems, even outside the economic sphere, have found that such arrangements often breed inflexibility and resistance to change traits that can be especially damaging when rapid adaptation is required. Another criticism focuses on the system's impact on individual freedoms. Command economies, by their very nature, limit the choices available to both consumers and producers. The emphasis on collective goals may come at the expense of personal initiative, as people are assigned work or receive goods based on the plan rather than personal preference. Over time, this can erode not only economic liberty but also broader democratic rights, as those in power may suppress dissent or alternative viewpoints to maintain the coherence of the plan. Critics warn that concentrating economic power in the hands of the state can lead to political repression, with limited scope for independent thought or action. Innovation, too, is often a casualty of central planning. With little competition and scant reward for risk-taking, enterprises have few incentives to experiment with new technologies or processes. The system's focus on meeting quotas and following established routines tends to discourage the creative thinking that propels economies forward. While market economies thrive on the churn of new ideas and the entry of bold entrepreneurs, command economies often lag behind, adopting innovations slowly and sometimes only after they have been proven elsewhere. As the global economy becomes more complex and interconnected, the inflexibility of command economies becomes increasingly evident. Evidence suggests that such systems struggle to respond to rapid technological change, shifting consumer preferences, or evolving international conditions. The very mechanisms that provide stability and predictability in the short run can leave the system ill-equipped to handle surprises or seize new opportunities. Scholars studying the legacies of command economies in Central and Eastern Europe have described these systems as trapped on a plateau, able to maintain a certain level of output and organization, but resistant to the marginal adjustments and constant adaptation that dynamic economies require. Corruption and mismanagement are further risks. When so much authority is concentrated in the hands of planners and bureaucrats, the system can foster favoritism, bribery, and the protection of inefficient enterprises. Without the discipline of market competition, failing firms may be shielded from the consequences of poor performance, leading to further waste and a drag on overall productivity. These structural weaknesses have been observed in various forms across different command economies, regardless of their specific national context. Yet it is important to recognize the diversity of experiences among countries that have implemented command economies. Not all have followed the same path, and some have attempted to introduce reforms or incorporate elements of flexibility into their systems. The outcomes have depended on a wide range of factors, including political leadership, cultural traditions, and the external environment. What remains consistent, however, is the tension between the promise of equity and stability on one hand and the persistent realities of inefficiency and rigidity on the other. In the final analysis, the debate over command economies is not simply a technical question of resource allocation. It is a contest of values, how much weight should be given to equality and security, and how much to freedom and innovation. The historical record offers no simple answers, but the strengths and weaknesses of these systems continue to shape discussions about the appropriate role of the state in economic life, especially as societies confront the challenges of inequality, technological disruption, and global interdependence. In the 21st century, the world looks dramatically different from the era when command economies dominated vast regions. Today, the archetype of a pure command economy, where the state owns all resources and sets every economic priority, is exceedingly rare. Most countries have shifted, to varying degrees, toward mixed models that blend government oversight with private enterprise and market mechanisms. Yet, the legacy of command economies continues to shape economic thinking and policy, and the ongoing evolution of these systems offers important lessons for contemporary society. The global economic landscape has changed profoundly in recent decades. Where once the central debate was between state planning and free market competition, today's reality is far more nuanced. Few, if any, nations adhere strictly to either extreme. Instead, most have crafted mixed economies, drawing selectively from both traditions. This synthesis allows for the dynamism and innovation of the market while still enabling government intervention to address social goals, correct market failures, and provide stability. In this environment, the fundamental question is not whether to have state involvement, but how much and in what form. China's transformation stands as one of the most striking examples of adaptation. After decades under the rigidities of central planning, China began a gradual transition toward a mixed system. This was not simply a matter of copying Western models, but rather selectively introducing market mechanisms while retaining strong government direction in strategic sectors. The results were extraordinary: rapid economic growth, a dramatic reduction in poverty, and a new emphasis on innovation and private consumption. Even as the economy opened to markets, the Chinese government maintained a significant role, especially in areas it considered vital for national development. This approach has sparked ongoing debate among policymakers and scholars about the appropriate balance between state intervention and market freedom. Some argue that China's blend of planning and competition is uniquely suited to its context, while others point to the challenges that arise when the lines between public and private are blurred. Cuba offers a different but equally instructive example. In recent years, Cuba has loosened government control and permitted the emergence of private businesses, reflecting a broader global trend toward structural adjustment and increased openness to trade. The process has been gradual and cautious, with the state still playing a central role in directing economic priorities. Yet, the very presence of private enterprise and the shift toward market exchanges, even within a socialist framework, signals an adaptation born of necessity. Globalization and the pressure to compete on the world stage have nudged even the most steadfast command economies to reconsider their approach. This embrace of flexibility is not unique to former command economies. In today's complex, interconnected world, adaptability has become essential for survival and prosperity. Companies and entire national economies must constantly adjust to technological advances, shifting consumer demands, and the unpredictable tides of global trade. The lesson that emerges, both for private firms and for governments, is that rigid adherence to any single model can be a liability. Instead, the capacity to change, whether by deregulating, investing in innovation, or rethinking the balance between public and private sectors, often determines whether a country thrives or falters in the face of new challenges. The modern mixed economy embodies this pragmatic spirit. By combining elements of both market and planned systems, mixed economies attempt to harness the best of both worlds. Private enterprise and competition drive efficiency and innovation, while government intervention through regulation, subsidies, and redistribution aims to address inequality, provide public goods, and protect against the excesses of unfettered markets. The boundaries are fluid, and the proportions vary widely from one country to another, but the underlying principle is the same. Flexibility, rather than dogma, is the order of the day. The persistence of government intervention in nearly all economies today is, in part, a legacy of the command economy era. Even in countries that champion the free market, there is broad acceptance of the need for regulation, social safety nets, and public investment in infrastructure, education, and research. The lessons learned from the shortcomings of both pure planning and pure markets continue to inform debates about the appropriate role of the state. Policymakers must grapple with questions of how to foster growth while ensuring its benefits are widely shared, how to encourage private initiative without sacrificing social cohesion, and how to respond to crises, economic, environmental, or otherwise, that require collective action. Recent experiences have only heightened the importance of adaptability. As the global economy faces rapid technological change, demographic shifts, and environmental pressures, the capacity to adjust policies and institutions becomes ever more critical. For some countries, this means continuing to open markets and remove barriers to private investment. For others, it involves strengthening the regulatory framework or expanding public investment to address new challenges. The key, evidence suggests, is not to cling to a fixed ideology, but to learn from experience and be willing to reform when circumstances demand it. Scholars and policymakers draw on the history of command economies when confronting these issues. The inefficiencies and rigidities that plague centrally planned systems serve as cautionary tales, warning against the dangers of excessive centralization and the neglect of market signals. At the same time, the achievements of those systems, whether in mobilizing resources, reducing inequality, or ensuring basic security, remind us of the value of collective action and social planning. The modern mixed economy, in effect, is a living laboratory in which countries experiment with different blends of market and government, seeking to strike a balance that fits their particular needs and aspirations. There remain open questions, and the debate is far from settled. Some argue that government intervention is essential to address market failures and promote social welfare, while others contend that it risks stifling innovation and entrenching inefficiency. The lesson that emerges most clearly from the experience of command economies is that context matters. Policies that succeed in one country or era may falter elsewhere, and the ability to adapt to learn from both success and failure is perhaps the most valuable legacy of all. As we look to the future, the relevance of these lessons only grows. The world continues to change at a dizzying pace, bringing new opportunities and new risks. The story of command economies is not a closed chapter, but a continuing source of insight. Whether in designing economic policy, managing crises, or striving for a more just and prosperous society, the experience of the past remains a vital guide. In the end, it is not the triumph of one model over another that defines success, but the capacity to adapt, to blend, and to innovate in pursuit of common goals.